Greetings, YouTube. I want you to imagine that all the caps have melted. There are no ice caps, there are no glaciers, they're all gone. We have let greenhouse gases run rampant. We have done nothing to stall or reverse climate change. And it's just gone as far as it can. We're going to lose coastlines. And if I remember, I will link to a map that will show what the world looks like after all the ice caps are melted, because people have generated them. And you do lose coastlines, but there's still lots of land. The problem is that a lot of that land isn't going to be habitable. Why am I talking about this? Well, I recently was looking at a game called Polaris. I mentioned this in my last video. And deals with colonies in the underwater, not underworld, underwater, and which is a cool idea. And in the event that that would happen, you would most definitely have underwater colonies. They're just there's energy sources and geothermal, and of course, if it's far enough in the future, you got fusion, and the underwater environment is going to be far safer from those temperature changes and things. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of things that are very cool about underwater. Sequest 2020, and what was the submarine show with Roy Scheider? I can't remember now. Sequest DSV or something? I can't remember what that was. Sealab 2020, that's right. Sealab 2020, Sequest DSV. Now I got it straight. Loved that show, even though it was a little silly. You're going to lose coasts, and there will be underwater colonies, absolutely. But that's not going to be the only thing that's going to happen. Now, again, large swaths of the planet are going to be uninhabitable. I figure everything south of, like, and for using the United States as an example, I think south of, like, the Canadian border is probably going to be uninhabitable the closer you get to the equator. The border states would probably be habitable in the sense that you might be able to do things on the surface so long as you live underground. So it might be a situation where you have mole people. They live underground in the daytime and they come out at night to do farming and husbandry, animal husbandry. They move the animals underground with themselves, and then they can move everybody back up outside for grazing and things like that, and raising crops that have been modified to survive in the harsher environment they find themselves in. But that's still going to be valuable because there's going to be real estate that can be farmed and access to resources that you may not get north, or obviously on the other end of the side of another pole south of the uninhabitable zone. So those border regions, I think, will still be inhabited by Mo folks. There will also be actual bunkers, like Fallout 4 style vaults. Like, for example, somebody might turn Cheyenne Mountain into one, which I think would be very cool. I've always loved Cheyenne Mountain. And I'm sure that there are other ones like out there, like the Greenbrier um, uh, Hotel, which you can see a lot of in Fallout 4, actually in Fallout 76, which is a real place. It was a bunker for the government. Of course, they have other ones out there we don't know about. And some of those will survive, and some of them maybe actually be able to turn into vaults where people can live long term, particularly as we get closer to the inevitability of the Earth becoming uninhabitable in many places. So there will be underground bunkers where folks will survive for who knows how long, and they have their own particular cultures developed. It's kind of an interesting concept. But north of the Canadian border, it's going to be tropical. And as you get further and further north, it'll become semi-tropical until you get to the poles, which will be temperate. Now, in the North Pole, there's no land. If the ice caps are gone, you're in the ocean. But that doesn't mean you can't have mega yachts that are completely capable of self-sufficiency, which I'm sure they will be. But also people bolting together cargo vessels and old tankers to turn them into floating islands, or genetically engineering coral that creates a pumice-like structure so that it floats, and you build colonies, you build villages or towns, maybe even cities that float up there in the temperate zones, and you farm the ocean. Of course, again, one of the things you have a big advantage at the South Pole is there is land there. Antarctica is a landmass. It's covered in ice right now, but it is an actual landmass, 5.7 million square miles. To give you an idea how much that is, Russia is 6.6. So it's a big landmass. Now you can also have some of the coast be absorbed by the higher water levels, but that doesn't mean there will still not be a big chunk of land that is temperate. Now, current treaties, I believe, say that no one nation may claim Antarctica. Kind of the same thing they have with the moon. Um, and there are sections that are already being occupied by different nations, and that is just going to continue. And the big players in this are going to eat up the biggest chunks of Antarctica. And I think the big players are going to be the US, Russia, China, the EU, and India. I think those are going to be the ones that really grab the biggest pieces and are able to hold them because they have the technology and the military to do it. There will be a consortium of other smaller Asian nations that have their sections. The same thing will happen to Africa and to South and Central America. They will all have groups that have banded together to carve out their own sections. Now I know that some people may think, well, you're not going to discount the entire continent of Africa. I'm not discounting it, but large sections of it are not going to be habitable. And even though there are many highly advanced cities in Africa today, just as advanced as any other city in the world, um, African nations don't tend to have the military might that the big players do. So even if they join forces, they're not going to be able to take on Russia or the US or the EU or China or India. They just can't. So I'm not disrespecting the African nations because I have just as much respect for them for anybody. But they're just not going to be a big player in this because of their lack of military might. And that this is going to be about military might. What you can hold is what you get. There may be alliances, of course, and there are going to be countries that kind of are on somebody's coattails, like Australia. I'm sure the Australians will be on the British, EU coattails probably, because they don't have the military might to take a big chunk. And Australia is not going to be a good place you want to be in. If all the ice caps melt and the heat temperature keeps rising, big chunks of Australia will become uninhabitable. Maybe in the furthest southern parts of that continent will there be places you can live, but I'm not sure. So the world is going to be different, and you will have floating cities and underwater cities, right? And you'll have bunkers and you'll have mole people. But you're also going to have off-world colonies. I think very much like The Expanse. Also, Cyberpunk 2020 did a pretty good job of giving a description of how the off-world colonies are set up. So you're going to have people on the moon, on Mars. You could, if they're smart, they'll have a nice large station, an O'Neill-style station at the L5 position between Earth and Moon. That'd be a great place for all kinds of business and for a shipyard and building things to going every different places in our system. You're probably going to have people living in the asteroid belt, probably in habitats, O'Neill style habitats over the gas giants, because the gas giants are full of useful volatile chemicals that could be accessed by people who need them. So, I mean, and I don't think we'd have this huge number of people out there in space, maybe 100, maybe 150 million, something like that, but enough that are a viable genetic swash of us. The problem, of course, is that as generations pass and people adapt to living on the moon and Mars, unless they have some kind of nanotechnology to keep their bones and their bodies to function in a 1G environment, they're going to be very different people than they are now. They are not going to be able to survive. There will be people living out in complete, 0G, free fall, that will have themselves genetically modified so they have 4 arms. They don't have legs anymore. They have 4 arms. They're never going to go into gravity well. They know they're never going to go into gravity well. This makes their life easier. So it's going to be a much different future. I see, again, transhumanism is something I'm a big supporter of, and I see very much this being a transhuman future. There will be Abe sapien type aquatic people. There will be mer people. There will be people who can never breathe air again. They have committed themselves and their descendants to be completely living under the oceans forever. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just going to be a much different future. But the Polaris game I mentioned, they may say that the surface world is going to be completely uninhabitable, and I don't think it will. They're talking about no ozone layer and radiation and stuff, and I don't think the ozone layer is going to go away. We've done a really good job of repairing it, and we have eliminated a lot of the things that would harm it again. Um, as far as radiation is concerned, I wouldn't be surprised if there were small nuclear exchanges on the way to like everything melting, but I do not believe it will be a full-blown exchange. I really don't. There may be a few craters on the planet, maybe a dozen or so, that are going to be sources of radiation, but that's not going to throw enough up into the atmosphere to be dangerous for very long. That will be settled out. That will go away eventually. Those particular craters will be dangerous for a very long time, but again, that doesn't last forever, and people will eventually return to those zones if they have useful resources, if they're in the right place for growing food. Humanity is not going to be wiped out by this. It's just going to become a very different place, and the disparity between the wealthy and the poor is going to be even more stark than it is now. The poor will be forced to live in the zones closer and closer to the uninhabitable sections, while the wealthy, live in the temperate sections up north and on floating islands, and in the south on the Antarctic continent or island. Is it a continent? Is Antarctica considered a continent? I don't remember now at the top of my head. I apologize. Um, but yeah, if the ice caps completely melt, the world's going to be different. And I really see it as a place rife for a really good cyberpunk style game. Of course, heavy emphasis on, underwater technology. So having a good resource, and Polaris is a pretty good resource as far as stuff is concerned, the materials in the setting, and maybe some inspiration for some of their, organizations and alliances. But it isn't going to be quite as bleak as that game presents it. They really think that the surface world's going to almost completely disappear, and the sections that are left are uninhabitable, and I don't think that's going to happen. We're going to lose some land, but not all the land. It's just that so much of it will be so hot that you can't live there any longer, and that it's going to kill a lot of the things that we need to live, both plants and animals. It's going to be a massive extinction event, but we will survive and the planet will survive. And if we have learned to stop producing more carbon dioxide, eventually it will pass. Now, there was a novel I read, and I forget which one it was, where some scientists came up with essentially this airborne plankton. And I believe it was she, a woman, and she released it into the atmosphere, and it was designed to consume carbon dioxide. So it was a plant and produce oxygen. So it was purpose was to bring the level of carbon dioxide down, because as it died, it essentially rained onto the ground and it just became plant matter. But she had built a trigger into it so that if the CO2 level falls below a certain level, the plants can't breed. They can't survive. So it was a self-defeating organism, and she did that intentionally. So as this plankton brings the CO2 levels on the planet Earth down far enough to where you want them to be, this stuff dies off, and then the skies are blue again instead of being green. But they've consumed the CO2 and put it into physical form. They're, the dead plankton, which is rained down upon the Earth. That was a very cool idea, and I think something like that would be very applicable in a cyberpunk game or something. Somebody comes up with that and they release it into the atmosphere, and it's a long game. You're talking centuries, but it would eventually turn the dial back, and slowly over time, as the world got cooler and cooler, more and more of the territory that had been abandoned would be reclaimed. Those mole people would move further and further south. There would be more and north, and there would be more and more of the planet which would be habitable until eventually you get back to the equator. And if the CO2 levels ever get to the point where they're equal to what we have now or lower, I think the target will probably be like 1800. That's just me. But eventually you could reclaim the planet. Again, it's a long game, but I think it's possible. So I think that things shouldn't be as bleak as we necessarily have them in a lot of RPGs. I mean, bleak in the sense that from our point of view, it's a horrible future. It is a horrible future, one that we may have already put ourselves on inexorably. There may be no way to stop it at this point, which is kind of sad. And there will be people that live off-world, and they live on floating islands, and they live in bunkers, and they live beneath the ocean. And some will become fish folks who will forever dwell underwater, creating new cultures and new societies, using dolphin-like language and a lot of sign language. Sign language will be very popular. There will be a very unique form of sign language, very much tailored to their environment. But sign language will be very important because underwater it's difficult to communicate. Even in clicks, hand signs are a heck of a lot more versatile than that is, I think. But yeah, so let's talk about if the ice caps melt, what the world will look like in your opinion. And if you think I'm completely off board here, I mean, I'm basing this on a very solid layman's understanding of climate and the planet and geopolitical structures. In some ways, I've been spending the last 40 years of my life reading a lot of diverse things to get me to the point where I kind of have a grasp on this. It wasn't intentional, but it's where I am. So let's talk about if the ice caps are gone. Not something we want, but in our RPGs, something that maybe we can use.